there are 3 volumes of Capital. So if you really want to understand the capitalist mode of production, you have to read the 3 volumes of Capital. Volume 1 is just one particular perspective on the capitalist mode of production. But even worse, the 3 volumes of Capital are only about an eighth of what he had in mind. Here's what he wrote in a text called the Grundrisse, which is a preparatory text where he's setting out various designs for Capital. He says, okay, what I'm going to do is to go through the analysis as follows. We're going to deal with 1, the general abstract determinants which obtain more or less in all forms of society. 2, the categories which make up the inner structure of bourgeois society and on which the fundamental classes rest. Capital, wage labour, landed property, their interrelation. Town and country, the 3 great social classes, exchange between them. Circulation, the credit system, good topic right now. Private. 3, concentration of bourgeois society in the form of the state, viewed in relation to itself. The unproductive classes, taxes, state debt, public credit, the population, the colonies, emigration. 4, the international relations of production, international division of labour, international exchange, export and import, rate of exchange, another good topic. 5th, excellent topic, the world market and crises. So this is, if you like, the panorama he laid out in the Grundrisse of what it was he wanted to do. This is what he had in mind that he was going to do when he wrote Capital. He never finished it. He never took up most of those topics. So what you have in Capital is the beginning of this massive kind of project. A massive project which he hinted at in lots of places about, you know, how to understand the state, how to understand civil society, how to understand immigration, how to understand currency exchanges and things like that. So here too we have to understand both that the conceptual apparatus at the beginning he's really trying to design it in such a way that it bears the burden of all of that. But in fact, what it then does is it provides the framework within which Volume 1 operates. And Volume 1 is just one single piece of this whole puzzle that he's laid out. And Volume 1 is really essentially looking at the capitalist mode of production from the standpoint of production, not of the market, not of global trade, but the standpoint of production. And so you're going to have to recognize that what you're going to get out of this course is an analysis by Marx of a capitalist mode of production from the perspective of production. Volume 2 does the perspective of exchange. Volume 3 does materials about crisis formation, and also rules of distribution, interest, rent, taxes, those kinds of issues. But then comes the method, the other part of the method, which is very important in terms of the method of presentation and the method of inquiry. And that is Marx's use of dialectics. What he says, again in his preface, is that in dialectics we find a completely different concept of analysis. you'll find hardly any causal language in Marx. Marx doesn't say this causes that. He nearly always says this is dialectically related to that. And a dialectical relation is an inner relation, not a causative external relation. It's an inner relation. And he talks about this dialectical method again in the postface to the second edition. He says, okay, I took up some ideas from Hegel. But he says, my dialectical method is in its foundations not only different from the Hegelian, but exactly opposite to it. There are ways in which I think we're going to find that's not exactly true. That in fact, Marx revolutionized the dialectical method. He didn't simply invert it, as is sometimes said. He then goes on to say this, I criticized the mystificatory side of the Hegelian dialectic nearly 30 years ago. And what Marx is referring to here is his tract called A Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Law, Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, whichever the title is. And I think that that critique played a very foundational moment in which Marx defined his relationship to the Hegelian dialectic. So he goes on talking about this mystificatory aspect and the way in which this mystified form of the dialectic, as purveyed by Hegel, became the fashion in Germany, and why it was that he had to reform it in such a way as that it could take account of every historical developed form as being in a fluid state, in motion. And he had to refigure it so that it could grasp the transient aspects of a society as well. And he then goes on to talk about this as being this dialectical method does not let itself be impressed by anything, being in its very essence critical and revolutionary. Now, what he's talking about here is he's going to use a version of dialectical method to establish relations between elements within his system. But he's going to do it in such a way as to capture fluidity and motion. Marx, above all, is incredibly impressed with the fluidity and the dynamics of capitalism. Now, this is very weird because Marx is often talked about as if he is a static, structural analyst. The weird thing is when you read Capital, you realize he sees the motion. He sees the movement all of the time. He's constantly talking about that movement, and that movement is a dialectical movement. So one of the ways in which also you have to read Marx in Marx's own terms is to try to grapple with what he means by dialectics. Because the problem is he never wrote a tract on dialectics. He never said, okay, this is my dialectical method. There are hints of it. If you really want to understand his dialectical method, you read Capital. That's the best place to get it. And when you've read Capital very carefully, you will come out with a sense of how dialectical method works. But again, this is going to be a bit confusing because you're probably not yet used to dialectical reasoning, and the curious thing about academia is the more well-trained you are in a discipline, probably the less used you are to dialectical method. In fact, young children are very dialectical. They see everything in motion. They see contradiction everywhere, and they're quite contradictory about everything, and every contradiction goes into everything else, and your kids say all kinds of wondrous contradictory things to you, and you kind of say, now you've got to stop thinking about that. You have to think rationally. And you kind of say, so we train people out of being good dialecticians almost from the, day two. But in fact, dialectical method is intuitively very, very powerful. And in a sense, what Marx is doing is recovering that incredibly intuitive dialectical method and putting it to work both in terms of an analytic schema, as we will see, but also in terms of understanding that everything is in process. Everything is in motion. Everything is defined in those terms. He doesn't talk about labor. He talks about the labor process. Capital is not a thing. It is a process. It is in motion. Value does not exist unless it is in motion. When things stop, value disappears, and the whole system comes tumbling down. And those of you who remember very well what happened in the aftermath of 9/11 was things stopped. Motion stopped. Planes stopped flying. You couldn't get through the bridges. Everything. And in 3 days, suddenly everybody realized that capitalism would collapse if things didn't get in motion again. So suddenly, Giuliani comes on and says, for God's sake, get out your credit cards and go shop. Go back to Broadway. Go back and do this kind of stuff. Go back. Bush even appeared on a TV ad for the airline industry saying, get back and start flying. Get back in motion, In other words, capitalism is, as Jack Kerouac would say, so perpetually on the road. And if it's not always on the road, then it's nothing. So Marx is incredibly appreciative of that, and it's very strange to find him so often depicted as this static figure who's got it all worked out. No, it's in motion, it's changing, it's perpetually in motion. So here I think too, what Marx is trying to do is to find a conceptual apparatus that will help you understand that motion. And so some of his concepts are formulated in such a way that they're about relations, they're about transformative activity. This is like this at this moment, and it's like that at the next moment. And this can get quite confusing. But what he's trying to do is to get behind the confusion, come up with a conceptual apparatus, a deep structure, if you like, which is going to help you understand all of that motion which is going on around us perpetually. And particularly the way in which motion is actually instantiated within a capitalist mode of production. So one of the ways in which I think you have to try to understand Marx is by appreciating his dialectical method. Now, there are a lot of people, including many Marxists, who really don't like his dialectics. There's a whole sphere called analytical Marxism, for example, which kind of says, all of that dialectics, they actually like to call themselves no bullshit Marxists. Because they just basically say all that dialectics is just BS. And then there are actually other people who want to somehow or other take something that's very dialectical and turn it into a causative structure. And in fact, there's a whole positivist version of what Marx says. That is, strip away the dialectics. Now, this may be perfectly correct. I mean, I'm not making an argument saying, the analytical Marxists are wrong. I'm not going to make an argument that kind of say the people who turn it into a kind of positivist mathematical model are wrong. Maybe they're right. But what you have to do, if you're going to understand Marx's texts in Marx's terms, is you're going to have to grapple with the dialectic. And it's fine afterwards if you want to say Marx is wrong, the dialectic is wrong, I don't like it, it doesn't work, and this kind of thing. That's fine. But before you say that, you've got to understand what it is and how it's working. So part then of what we want to do is to spend some time recognizing that dialectical aspect of Marx and seeing how it works. Now there's one final point before we get to a break. I've asked you to try to read Marx in Marx's own terms, but obviously I'm your guide, and so you're going to read it with my help, and my terms are going to be very important. So one of the things I wanted to say here is that, of course, my interest in urbanization, in uneven geographical development, in imperialism, and all those kinds of things, that my interests have actually become very, very important in terms of affecting the way in which I read this text. In other words, I've been through 30-odd years of a dialogue between me and this text. And one of the reasons I like to teach it every year is every year I say to myself, how am I going to read it differently this year? What about it will strike me that I didn't notice before? And new things strike me because new events crop up. That is, history and geography change. And so there are certain things which arise, and I kind of come back and I look at Marx and say, well, does he have anything to say about this? And sometimes you find something really acute which he has to say about it. Sometimes not at all. So I've been through a long dialogue, and I use this way of thinking, many of these conceptual apparatuses, all of the time in the work I do. And in the process, of course, I've changed the way in which I understand the text. I suspect that if you had a recording of this class 25 years ago, you'd find me saying very different things from what I'm saying now. And that is, for a variety of reasons, both the historical climate has changed, the intellectual climate has changed, all sorts of issues have cropped up which didn't exist before, therefore you read it in a different way. Interesting point. In one of the prefaces, Marx talks about that process, about how bourgeois theory understood the world in a certain way, and then history moved on to make that theoretical formulation redundant, and that therefore ideas had to change as circumstances change. Or ideas had to be reconfigured. So you're going to get some of my reading in it too. And there's no way you can avoid that. But at the end of the day, what I want you to do is to come to your own reading of it. That is, engage with the text in terms of your experience, both intellectual, social, political, and have a good time talking to the text and letting the text talk to you, and appreciating the way in which Marx tries to understand the world. Because, above all, I think this text is a wonderful, wonderful exercise in seeking to understand what appears almost impossible to understand. So from this standpoint, you have to engage with the text. And okay, I'm going to be in your way a little of the time, but I hope not too much, because at the end of the day, it's your business to really translate what is going on in this text into meaning in your own life. That's what this book is so great at, I think it will speak to you in some way, probably not the same way to you as it does to me. And that is perfectly valid and perfectly reasonable. And I would like, therefore, for you to confront it in that kind of spirit. Now, okay, that's all I want to say in way of introduction.
What a couple of hillbillies can do.
همه تو با هم بگن ما دیگر به ایران نمیاییم. هر بیشی باشه بریم.
Well, I'm going to tell you fascists, you may be surprised. People in this world are getting organized. You're bound to lose, you fascists bound to lose.
حالا دست بالا. محکم بزن محکم یه بار بزن
All you fascists bound to lose.
I said,
All you fascists bound to lose.
yes,
All you fascists bound to lose. You're bound to lose. You fascists bound to lose.
there's people of every nation marching side by side, marching across the fields where 1,000,000 fascists died. You're bound to lose, you fascists bound to lose.
All you fascists bound to lose.